Well, thank you. About a year ago, our company began the process of looking into acquiring a very large and very expensive printing machine. I won't tell you how large or how expensive, but I will tell you it is the biggest thing that I have ever been involved with acquiring. And you can't really buy something like this. You have to lease it, of course. And in the process of this conversation, I had an opportunity to answer a few questions for the credit manager of the company that makes this machine. And he asked me a couple of questions, which I think were reasonable from his point of view. Some of them were about financials, okay, whatever. But then he said, with the rise of kind of e-books and e-textbooks and screens in classrooms and like e-everything, do you really think there is a market for teaching children reading and writing on paper? Which is a reasonable question for a person who has to take a risk on loaning you a lot of money. And I kind of answered that with a little bit of information I knew about how all the research shows that learning to read on paper is more effective, comprehension improves, skills are better, writing on paper activates parts of the brains that aren't activated in the same way when you're typing, whatnot. And then he asked a second question, and he said, now, with the rise of AI and large language models that basically can put words together better than most people, at least in terms of grammar and vocabulary and such, do you really think that there is a market for teaching writing in the future? And that one took me a little off guard. I tried to explain to him that, well, I live kind of in a different world. I work, with homeschoolers and classical schools and schools that kind of care about that type of skill. But I realized, yes, his question is a question that lots and lots of people might have today. In fact, it's not uncommon now to hear people in schools or even in schools of education arguing that, well, it's more important that we teach children how to use AI well than to teach them the skills which AI can do. So I thought about this for quite a while, and this is now my answer, a more well thought out answer to those questions. Francis Bacon, in his essay On Studies, wrote this elegant sentence. He said, "Reading maketh a full man, conference a ready man, and writing an exact man." And so this is kind of what we do at IEW, because we are concerned about furnishing the mind through reading, developing good speaking skills, and of course, the precision of thought that writing encourages. So I'd like to unpack these three and just get into them a little more in depth so that we can contemplate them well, and that should help us become better teachers, better tutors, better coaches, better parents of children, and as they develop their language skills, their arts of language. Reading maketh a full man. One of the expressions that I really like is this idea of furnishing the mind. I don't know if you've ever heard that idiom before. I'm not quite sure where was the first time I heard it, but it might have been in the book Jane Eyre, where Jane is talking about how she likes how Rochester's mind is furnished. And this idea of furniture, I like it because that's what's inside, right? And, you could have a great mansion of a mind, right? But if it's just kind of empty, what good is it? You could also have a small little bungalow of a brain like me, but if it's furnished with beautiful and good and useful things, then it's a pleasant place to live. And whether we like it or not, we pretty much live inside our mind, inside our memory, inside our imagination, inside our capacity to reason and think. So how do we furnish the mind? Well, Bacon says reading, right, maketh a full man. You have to say maketh because it's Elizabethan era, and man, of course, human. So when we read, we're furnishing our mind with so many things that we wouldn't encounter on a daily basis. The first thing I would point out is vocabulary, words. When we read a good or great book, we are likely to bump into words that we don't bump into in daily conversation, work, or interacting with family or friends. And sometimes we see a word and we think, wow, I'm not quite sure exactly what that word even means. I recognize it, but could I define it? Could I use it? And so reading provides us then the context for encountering words that we wouldn't necessarily bump into, and an opportunity to understand those words in the context of the writing. And of course, if we're a little bit aggressive about how we read, the chance to maybe go and look up that word, or in the modern world, just ask your phone, what does it mean? But we want then to acquire a vocabulary that actually expands the capacity for thinking. I have often kind of joked about the typical student who, if you ask them to write a composition about whatever, their dog, right? And you say, well, just write about your dog. They would write something like this. My dog is a really awesome dog. I really, really love my dog because she is awesome. She is fun and really good. And I really, really love my totally awesome dog. The end. Well, now, why is that happening? Part of the reason is that that child writer, they don't have a whole lot of words other than the ones that they could use to say something. And I've often noticed that as you work in expanding a child's vocabulary, as we do with IEW, giving them word lists of ly adverbs and substitutes for weak, lame, lousy verbs or adjectives, and we build this sensitivity to vocabulary, suddenly their writing becomes more powerful, more effective. They're able to say things that they're not able to say when they have the words for it. So the first level of furnishing the mind would have to do with vocabulary. And I believe that reading, and reading somewhat attentively, somewhat aggressively, is one of the best ways to help us continue. And it's a lifelong project, right? Even at my age, I can sometimes be reading something and see a word and think, I don't really know what that word is, or where it came from, or what do the roots mean, or how would you use it better? And then it's an opportunity to grow. And so vocabulary to me are just the most basic building blocks of thought. And, you know, in a way, it's almost impossible to think a thought unless you have the words to think it in. Yeah, we think abstractly, we have, artistic thoughts, we have impressions, but in terms of making those concrete, we can only do that when we have the words to think the thought, and then it becomes recordable or transmissible. Another thing that reading is so important for us is it gives us a big variety of syntax, grammar, different ways to say things. And again, we want to juxtapose kind of the literary level of language against our daily conversation. We talk to people generally in fairly short sentences. We're very efficient. We talk to kids. We talk to other adults. We talk on the phone sometimes. Mostly we just text now. But the world of language that we live in our busy daily lives doesn't really afford the opportunity for interacting with longer, more complex chunks of text, more complex thoughts. And this is why having an opportunity to read regularly at a level above our kind of daily conversation is essential for expanding our capacity for putting ideas together in increasingly complex, and I might say, artistic ways. When we read a good or great book and we see a sentence or a few sentences, sometimes it strikes us, that was just beautiful. That was more than just an idea. That was an idea beautifully said, beautifully presented. And then it activates our imagination. It tickles our artistic, aesthetic sense. And when these great writers can join together, goodness and truth and beauty and aesthetic quality, the language has this power on our souls that's so effective. And if we want to be able to do that to some degree, we need to steep ourselves in that sort of literature. And so that's another thing we gain, is this variety and flexibility with grammar and syntax that allows for essentially the reception and ultimately the communication of more complex and or more elegant thinking. And I'm sure that we have all had the experience of reading something that was written by someone, generally a long time ago, and you just think, wow, how did he get all of those ideas in that and make it sound so appealing and so engaging, and it's so powerful, and it's so true? And then those become part of the legacy left for us. And hopefully our generation will continue to grow in this way and leave a legacy for the future. And then our capacity for thinking should, theoretically, grow and expand generation to generation. What happens, however, is when we make everything very efficient and cut down, and as kind of, some schools have started to do, which is, well, let's just talk about the utility. Can you read for the purpose of doing a job? And it becomes very, very narrow and efficient, but not beautiful, elegant, and deep. Then what's that generation going to leave? So there's this flow of ideas that should kind of grow like a garden over time and become more beautiful with each season. The third thing that we gain from reading is a capacity to approach ideas that we would never approach in daily life. And this ability to go into the past, or sometimes go into the speculative future, or go into a different culture or a different world, that makes us bigger people. That makes us wiser, hopefully. It gives us an opportunity to consider things that we would never bump into, and then we can also learn. So when we read history, when we read literature, when we read, the things that people were thinking and talking about back then, it actually gives us more experience, more life experience, more life to live our lives with. And so we have this idea of, wisdom. What is wisdom? Better judgment would be one simple little definition. How do we make judgments? Based on the information and life experience we have. And so reading expands our capacity for absorbing other people's life experience. I always like to say, and you've probably heard this, the two things that will affect you more than anything else in terms of who you become. And I like to say this to children because they're still more in the process of thinking about who they're going to become. I'm pretty much became. I'm still trying to become, but I'm pretty much in the past tense. But for children, especially teenagers, the two things that will affect you the most are the people that you spend time with and the books that you read. Another way of saying that, which I like because it's a little more humorous and dramatic, say this to teenagers, the most significant thing that will affect who you become is the people you spend time with. And there are two kinds of people, living ones and dead ones. And then they don't like that. But no, it's perhaps the dead people and you have access to their mind, their thoughts, their life, their experience, their decisions for better or worse. And so that to me is so very important. So reading is this way in which we can furnish the mind, not just with vocabulary that expands our capacity to recognize, manipulate, and use ideas, with the complex syntax of language that further expands our capacity to do that with beauty and a power, a rhetorical power, but also the very ideas that our mind is being furnished with that help us improve in wisdom and judgment and life. Now, I do think that in our modern world, we have unfortunately narrowed down the definition of reading to decoding symbols with your eyes, knowing what those words mean, and passing a comprehension test to prove that you learned to read. And this is a sad thing because reading is so much bigger and so much more magnificent. But one of the things I have pointed out for many years is that not everybody reads with their eyes, nor does everybody who can read with their eyes read everything with their eyes. Blind people, obviously, learn to read without their eyes, sometimes with fingers in Braille. But we also can read with our ears. And this is why I believe that the most important thing that parents can do for their children is read aloud to them in huge quantity, as much as possible, at a level above their own decoding skills. Children's comprehension of language generally will be much higher than the language they can decode on paper. This is easily proven by spending any amount of time with a 6-year-old, right? Because 6, 7-year-old children can understand very sophisticated ideas, can sometimes tell you very sophisticated stuff, which will surprise you for their age, but they're still sounding out 3- and 4-letter words, and it's very tedious and painful. And unfortunately, the things that you have to use to learn to read can be tediously dull. I remember one little book I used to teach some of my children to read. It went something like this. Max the cat sat. The rat sat. Max and the rat sat. And you're just like, oh, this is mind-numbingly awful. But you need it so they can practice their, short vowels or whatever that little book is. But their intellectual capacity is so far beyond that stuff that they would learn to decode with. And so while they're learning their decoding skills, it's so important that we expose them to the vocabulary and the syntax and the ideas that are beyond what they would be able to access. And sadly, I have heard some people report that there is an idea, sometimes even promulgated by teachers in schools, perhaps not maliciously, but sadly, no, don't read to your kids, then they won't learn to read on their own. Okay, well, the number one predictor of adults who like to read is having been read to a lot as a child, right? And so if you want to help children love the literature and love reading and the activity engaging with that higher level language, you want to read to them well above their own decoding skills. And this is actually very important even as the gap starts to close, right? So you get kids and they hit maybe middle school age. Now their decoding skills are pretty good, but their comprehension is probably still above their decoding skills. And that's what actually pulls up comprehension. And then at some point you get maybe to the level where, yes, you can read on paper or read on a screen as well as you can hear the language. Although there's something about hearing the language that brings it to life a bit more. Have you experienced this? When you hear, say, a well-read audiobook, and it just brings it to life, and you see it in your imagination in a almost more powerful way than you would if you were trying to kind of read it and let those words go by. I discovered for myself, I don't know if this is true for anybody, but I tend to remember and possibly even understand things better if I read them aloud. So when my kids were around and I had a willing audience, I would pretty much just, anything I was reading that I thought was interesting, I would just start reading aloud, because I thought, well, if it's interesting to me, it should be interesting to everybody. And then they could either stick around and listen or disappear and go do whatever else. But this idea of reading to each other, it's such a rich, deep tradition that we had, but we're really losing that bedtime story culture or that read to the family culture. You know, I like to joke a little bit about what was life like before electricity? What did people do, right? You couldn't watch anything. You couldn't really very easily go anywhere. You couldn't really even turn on a radio, go all the way back into the, say, early to mid 1800s. There was nothing to do but sit around and read to each other. And that was the way families basically operated. From grandma in her rocker to the baby on the floor, people would be reading aloud to the whole family, reading, the scriptures, reading the literature of the day, reading historical stuff. And yeah, not everybody understood everything perfectly, but it's pulling everybody up. And so we had a very high level of literacy at that time because there was this reading culture in the home. And then with the rise of technology and electricity, rather than read, people would maybe listen. Rather than read, now people would watch the TV. Of course, the TV kind of even over my lifetime, got increasingly dumbed down. And now we don't even have the capacity for many people to watch a whole thing for half an hour. We have to scroll and get a new video every 90 seconds or 2 minutes, else we get close to boredom. So I would encourage any young parents out there today, and I hope that to whatever spheres of influence you have as a teacher, as a tutor, as a parent, as a grandparent, as a friend, try to encourage every parent to take the time to restore that bedtime story culture, restore the read aloud in the home, because that pulls up the comprehension, it furnishes the mind with the vocabulary, with the syntax, with the ideas that will elevate the human mind and spirit. And we have, I think, a particular challenge in our modern world to just put away the phone, put down the screen, turn it off, and pick up a book. And I don't know about you, but even I, who grew up before there was internet, in fact, I said to one kid, I am older than Google. He goes, wow. Yeah, we had a TV. My parents very wisely regulated it, right? But even I, who grew up in a time where reading was the main thing you did as a kid to not die of boredom, even I today have this almost like sickening connection with that phone. Like I need to have it nearby and I'm trying to read, but oh no, I better check the weather tomorrow. I need to read, but oh no, what's the price of gold? I need to read, but oh no, if I don't look at that phone every 10 minutes, I might miss the end of the world. And so we get very attached to this constant flow of communication and information. And I feel a little bit for young people, like some of you, you didn't grow up before that was life. And so it's maybe even harder to just find those dedicated chunks of time to engage the intellect and the imagination. The other thing, if we're just talking about very briefly the difference between screen-based experience and text-based experience, is imagination, right? So when you're reading a book, and I don't know, for some reason Treasure Island comes to mind. When you're reading the book, it's a little challenging. It's got some antiquated words and ways of saying things. But when you see that word, your mind is kind of forced to attach an image to the word, or a sequence of words, or a whole paragraph. Your human faculty will take words and translate it into images. And that really is the cultivation of imagination. Whereas if you're just watching everything, it's pre-imagined for you. It's almost, in a way, like pre-digested food, which does not sound good to me. I don't know about you, but I'm trying to stave off having to consume pre-digested food for as long as possible. But that's what so many young people are getting now, is everything is screen-based, everything is image-based, it's hyper-stimulating visually, and it's under-stimulating to the language and imagination faculty. And that's why I would say wise parents will always say, and I bet some of you have heard this one, you have to read the book before you can see the movie. Well, that's a good common sense, because the movie is going to create images that will displace your own faculty of imagination if you were to do it in the reverse order. The only exception to that, in my mind, is Shakespeare. Then watch the movie, then try to slog through the book, and it'll make a little more sense and everything. But for the most part, we don't want to preempt the imagination that happens with the interaction of language and memory and experience that builds those things with just the ready to go, you don't have to put out any effort, just watch this thing, kind of turn off your brain. And people will say that. Oh, I'm so tired, I just need to shut down for a while. I'm not sure that's actually a good form of recreation for anyone, but we do have that attitude. Well, or here was the joke I heard. As soon as I get up in the morning, I look at a tiny screen so that I can go to work and look at a big screen. And then when I come home, I look at a bigger screen so that I can relax from having looked at screens all day. And, so many of us do find ourselves in that situation. Whereas maybe what we would want to say is, I wake up and I listen to something, then I have to go to work and look at screens, but then I can come home and I can be screen-free, and I can cultivate recreation, real recreation with imagination. So I could probably go on and talk about that idea forever, but we've got a couple more topics to include in this. So moving on. Conference maketh a ready man. Now that word conference could also be translated as something like discourse, or even just speaking. Like speaking maketh a ready man. So we've all had this experience of needing to speak and kind of looking for the words that we want to find to say exactly what we want to say in the right way. This happens less in day-to-day conversation and more when we have a need for more formal conversation or formal presentations. But it's very interesting how speaking helps to confirm or solidify vocabulary. So when you learn a word, you hear it, you read it, you kind of know what it means, you see it again, you still kind of know what it means. But when you intentionally use that word verbally, it moves that word from kind of passive vocabulary into active vocabulary. And this, I think, is extremely important for us as teachers of the arts of language, is to help move the passive vocabulary into the active category. And one very easy way to do this is through memorized language. Because when we memorize something, then we are practicing, we recite it, we hear ourselves say that word again and again and again. It's in the context of whatever we've memorized, probably a poem for the most part, and then we start to understand the word better by using it. Now, children will experiment with words. You've probably seen them, try to impress you with a word, and they don't quite know what it means, and it's a little bit goofy, but they're working on it. They learn how to use words by trying to do so. So one of the things I've noticed is that when children memorize poetry, in particular, and you could put in scripture, you could put in excerpts from, historical documents or famous speeches, but we'll think about poetry. Those children are kind of forced now to say words and use grammatical constructions that are different and usually more sophisticated than they would normally use in just talking to their friends or talking to parents or teachers' daily life. So once again, the literary experience has a power of elevating us above our daily life usage. I remember learning a poem at a young age, and I'm guessing 10 to 12 years old. I don't remember exactly when I learned this poem, but I do remember that when I first saw it, heard it, read it, whatever, I thought, that is cool. I want to learn that poem. And so I did. It's a short poem. Would you like to hear it? Okay. So here's the poem. See if you can figure out what it is. Scintillate, scintillate, globule vivific. Fain would I ponder thy nature specific. Loftily poised in ether capacious, strongly resembling a gem carbonaceous. Do you recognize this? Yes, if I sing it, scintillate, scintillate, globule vivific, fain would I ponder, then, oh yeah, that makes sense. But it was this simple little twinkle, twinkle, little star, rephrased with all this highfalutin, super sophisticated vocabulary. But I remember, as 10, 11, 12 years old, whatever I was, walking around being able to use words like ponder, fain, capacious. That was one of my favorites. Now, I was probably a little cocky and obnoxious about using these words, but that's called being 12 years old. However, what's interesting to me in retrospect is that just memorizing that short little poem with that kind of extraordinary, outside the ordinary level of vocabulary, it strengthened not just my ability to use those words, but my interest in learning more words and using more words. And I have seen time and time and time again how memorized language will come out in the spoken or written expression of children. And I could give you many examples of this, but the example I'd like to use, I think, is the most dramatic one that I know. And it kind of blows my mind every time I think about it. And that is the example of Frederick Douglass. Are you familiar with Frederick Douglass? He wrote a few versions of his autobiography, and I highly recommend everyone at some point in their early, not too early, teen or young adult years, read an autobiography of Frederick Douglass, because his story is so amazing. But he was born into slavery, and he was separated from his parents at a young age, and he was forced to work at hard labor pretty much all his waking hours, probably 6.5 days a week. And at that time and place, it was actually illegal to teach an enslaved person to read or learn anything. It was essentially illegal to educate them, because the fear, of course, is that they learned to read and had some education, they would rebel, and that would be a problem. Okay. So that lasted until he was about 12 years old. And then his situation changed a little bit, and some of the kids that he had interaction with tried to teach him how to read by, writing letters and words in the dirt. Talk about a cheap curriculum. And then he became, I would argue, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, American orator that our nation has ever produced. You might argue that some before him were above that level, Patrick Henry, for example, but I can't think of a single person who lived after Frederick Douglass who comes even close in power and eloquence. And so it kind of begs the question. Here's a person who had the worst education you could contrive, short of being chained in a closet 24/7, and he became the most powerful and eloquent writer and speaker that we know of. How did this happen? Well, we know a little bit because one of his biographers asked him, Mr. Douglass, how did you become such a powerful speaker? And this was his answer. As a free man, one of the first books I owned was The Columbian Orator. Now, this book was published in, I believe, 1795, so before his time. And it was a collection of kind of the most famous speeches in all of history, from ancient times, Cicero, through all the medieval up to Patrick Henry. And so it was a collection of all the best stuff that had been written or translated into English. And he said, I committed them all to memory. He memorized an entire book of speeches. And what did this do? Again, it furnished and reinforced in his mind not just the vocabulary, which is extensive, not just with the variety of grammar and syntax, which is also broad and beautiful, not just with the rhetorical devices, the schemes and tropes that make language winsome and powerful and poetic in our soul, but in many ways with the seminal ideas of goodness and truth and justice and right. I think this is one of the most remarkable things, and so I want to encourage you to consider how can we incorporate this memorized, if you will, language in the process of furnishing the mind of children. Now, I don't really like the word memorize in that it sounds kind of mechanical. It's kind of got a bad rep in progressive modern education circles in some cases. My mother was a music teacher, and I don't think she ever used the word memorize your piece. Instead, she said, well, now that you can play it, now you must learn it by heart, right? Learn by heart. We don't hear that idiom too much anymore, but it underscores the truth. What you do memorize will come into your heart. It'll come into your soul. Therefore, we should be very careful what we memorize. And some people who kind of criticize the idea of, oh, why make children memorize stuff? It's rote learning, it's whatever. Well, children are wired for memorizing stuff. If you don't give them good and beautiful things to memorize, they will memorize whatever garbage is in their environment. I remember working very hard to be able to say, 2 all beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun. Why? Who needs the formula for a Big Mac? Well, it was the McDonald's commercial again and again. It was really fast. 2 all beef patties, special sauce, cheese, pickles. I thought that'd be cool. So there I am, just a little kid, innocently sitting there watching TV commercials every day, memorizing whatever junk. Now some of the junk is even worse because it comes through sources that are even further from McDonald's in terms of being good or true or beautiful, if that's possible. So that would be the first aspect of speaking that we could consider, is the power of memorized language. And if we go way back into the ancient schools of rhetoric, that was what everybody did. They memorized the stories and the speeches and the poems of the people that had come before in order to furnish and make themselves ready to operate in their current world and use the vocabulary and the language and the ideas. We can expand this idea of speaking to more intentionality in our conversation. I was reading a book which I enjoyed very much. I recommend you all read. It's called How to Think Like Shakespeare. And it's not about Shakespeare so much as just the time period that he grew up in, the English Renaissance. And one of the things that kind of tickled me was how people would schedule, like just average people who were, making gloves or being a seamstress or bricklayers, or I guess they didn't have quite bricklayers, stonemasons, but just average people who did average jobs in the average world then. They would actually have events. They would schedule times where they would get together in small groups and discuss specific things at a specific time for the purpose of improving their ability to have conversations and debates, or what Bacon called conference or discourse. And that was a very important cultural and developmental idea in Shakespeare's time. I don't think we do that very much, do we? I think the closest we might get is the ladies' book club. All right, we're all going to read a book and get together and talk about it. Nobody has time to read the book, but they get together and talk. And that's okay. But this idea of let's get together with intention and talk about something that is valuable or matters to us. We do have conferences and we have opportunities to hear people talk and maybe ask some questions and all that. But this idea of almost a self-created Socratic discussion environment, I think is quite rare in today's world. I do know some schools that are working on kind of recapturing the idea of Socratic discussion in the school, and that's wonderful, but I think we could also do that in our homes to some degree. In fact, I have a good friend who has mentioned many times about how when his children were young, they would have a family debate night, and they would, have the kids, I think there were 7 of them maybe, or 5 or 7, depending on who's there, and have a subject for debate and divide into groups, and you argue for and you argue against, and now you have to ask questions and go back and forth and have rebuttals. And, I think that would be a great thing to grow up in if you have, enough kids to do it. I mean, you could do it just 2 on 2. That's team policy debate. It only takes 4 people. And then you address an issue of import to the family or of import to the community or the society to some degree, depending. And this idea, I have another good friend, and I always like going to dinner with this particular friend because he will almost always, as we sit down and have the little chit chat, he will take the lead and say, I propose as a topic for discussion this evening, blah, 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 blah. And so then that is kind of like, oh, okay, we've just elevated our whole dinner here from chit-chat to engaging with ideas. And so I think we can find more opportunities to engage with ideas, to have conference, to have discourse, to have these ways of communicating ideas back and forth. And we may not agree, and that's very good, because if we don't have an opportunity to kind of argue and disagree and then agree or not, but remain friends, remain happy, then the whole society kind of starts to degrade into, well, I just don't like your idea, and you're stupid, and you're bad and wrong and evil, and then we have this polarization. And of course, the fragmentation of thought that, in general, social media creates can be, I think, very harmful. And so we can kind of be pioneers of civilization by looking back to the past and saying, what did people do when they could have arguments and still respect each other, or even like each other, even though they have disagreements? So this idea of civil discourse. We can take this one step further, and that would be the formalization and kind of the polish of the spoken word through public speaking. And this is an area I think has probably kind of lost its significance over time. I remember being at a friend's house once. She was very big into antiques. I am not into antiques really at all. They just have no charm for me. But she liked these things. And however, she had one thing that was really interesting to me. It was framed on a wall, and it was a report card from over 100 years ago, 1900-something, I believe. And so it was a school report card. And what was interesting is the subjects that were listed, that the child, and I don't remember what grade it was in particular, but it had the subjects. And so I was reading the subjects. I thought, wow, there are some subjects that are not here, like health. How was anyone healthy before they taught health in school? But there were some subjects that were there which you would never see on a report card today, and one of them was elocution. Elocution, what is that? The art of speaking well. And it begins with young children and poetry. Children 100, 150 years ago were responsible for memorizing big chunks of poetry, scripture. As they got a little bit older, memorizing excerpts of famous speeches. I think you could probably go back as recently as maybe 1900 1890-ish, and you would find that pretty much every middle school child had memorized and probably could recite the preamble to the Constitution, the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence, which is 72 words long, the last two paragraphs of Patrick Henry's Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death speech, and maybe a lot of other stuff. Why? Because that was part of the curriculum. People understood the value of being able to recite and remember. But then you take that one step further, and then what are you doing? You're writing a speech, and then you're giving a speech. And the best way to prepare yourself is to give speeches that other people gave, but then it all kind of comes together. You have to write the speech, and then you have to go through, how are you going to memorize this? Cultivating memory. And then you'd have to practice. Well, how are you going to deliver it? What are the right ways to talk to a group of people? Using gestures, using eye contact, projecting your voice, doing all of these things that, today, pretty much the only people who get this very well are the people in drama, the people who are on stage and they practice that stuff. But that's a specialized little group of people who are weird, right? The rest of us don't have to do that. But I believe there was this understanding back 100 years ago that this was a skill that made you better in all ways. You would be a better business person. You would be a better, if you were engaged in civic activity, if you went into government, if you went into teaching. I think today they still require teachers to take one public speaking class. I believe this is true. My wife, who got a degree in elementary education, procrastinated about the public speaking class so long that she'd finished every other single requirement for her degree and had to do that as a summer school thing in order to get the diploma. That's how much she did not like public speaking. But we valued that. So I think that in terms of just basically a base level leadership skill for kids to grow up and be comfortable standing in front of a group of people and presenting information. Then, of course, if they're writing their own speech, then they've got something to say, we hope. And that brings us to the third of our ideas here, which is writing. Writing maketh an exact man. Writing makes us more precise. One way I've heard it said, which I like very much, is writing is the distillation of thought. But let's back up a little bit and think about, if you have to write something, what has to happen in order for that to occur, right? If someone says, write something now about anything you want, that'd be the worst, right? What has to happen for you to do that? Well, the first thing is you have to find an idea, right? There has to be an idea. If there's no idea, there is nothing to write. You're dead in the water, give up and go home. So you have to find an idea. So part of it is the skill of finding ideas. And we use this term creative writing kind of loosely today. If we were to look back in an older way of thinking about this finding of ideas, the term was invention. It's actually one of the canons of classical rhetoric, invention. Invention, we think of, you invent something new. But what's interesting is the word invention comes from the Latin verb invenio, invenire, which means to find or discover. And the good news is you're not likely to find something or discover something that wasn't there already. You don't make something out of nothing. You find stuff and put it together. And that's true whether you're inventing a mechanical device or whether you're inventing a poem, right? So you have to find something. Now, if we look at sources of ideas, there's some categories. The first thing, ideas can be pre-existing in the memory and imagination, or they can pre-exist outside the memory and imagination. I'll give you a couple examples. If I said, please write about the last trip you took with your family, I'm asking you to go into memory and imagination, harness those sensory impressions, affix words to those sensory impressions, and then articulate it in such a way that approximates your experience for a reader. Okay? So that's dependent on memory and imagination. If I said to you, please write about the room you are in right now, that would be different, wouldn't it? Because you could just kind of look around and say, well, what do I see? And what can I say about what I see? And what does that make me think of? You'd go into memory and imagination, but the impetus would be immediate, right? Okay, so that's one division, memory and imagination versus something immediate. The other differentiation would be ideas can pre-exist in words, or they can pre-exist mostly in sensory impressions and experiences. Okay, give you an example. If I said, please write about your dog or your cat or your pet or whatever dog or cat you wish you had, right? I'm asking you to kind of go into memory and imagination, re-experience what you can see, what you've heard, what you feel, what is your dog to you, right? And there's not a lot of words there because dogs don't talk much. Right? And mostly it's kind of this visceral, emotional, what do you do with the dog? Especially if you're a kid. You play with it, you wrestle with it, you throw, you lick it, it licks you, it's this very sensory rich, visceral, but not a lot of words in that in terms of how it's stored in the brain. Whereas if I said, please write your favorite Aesop fable or fairy tale or parable from the Bible, all of those came to you in words. They were stored in your memory as words. Therefore, it's easier to do that because it came to you in words, it's going to go from you in words. So the easiest place to start when you're teaching writing is going to be something which is immediate and pre-exists in words. That is why, with our structure and style approach, we start with Unit 1 and 2. Here's a source text, take key words, tell it back, and then write it out, and we move from there toward the task of creative writing, memory, imagination, invention, and all that. So that's the first thing to think about. All right, now you found an idea. What do you have to do? Well, you have to kind of speak it into existence. If you're going to go write something, what do? You talk to yourself, don't you? You inside say what you're planning to write. Or sometimes little kids will actually say out loud what they're planning to write. And that's okay too, because this idea of being able to talk to yourself and then hear what you say to yourself, that's actually a skill, hearing what you said to yourself. Have you ever met children who can talk and not hear what they just said? Right, so there's a skill involved. So you have to speak it into existence, hear what you heard yourself say to yourself. Then you have to hold that language pattern in your memory long enough to go harness the technical information. How are those words spelled, and get spaces between them, and which ones get capitals, and do you need commas or apostrophes or periods, and where do they go, right? And then to get that down, right, then you have to go and get the next idea in the sequence, speak it into existence, hear what you heard yourself say to yourself, hold it in your memory, wrestle the technical information onto the page, and keep doing that until you're finished, whatever that means. And if there is a breakdown anywhere in that process, think of that poor child. It's going to be overwhelmed with the complexity of the thing. And if you ever meet a child who says something like, I hate writing, or I don't like it, or I'm not good at it, generally what they're saying is, I am overwhelmed by the process of trying to do this. And so our job as teachers and parents and coaches is to break that into the smallest possible, manageable, doable steps so that they don't get lost in that whole process. And of course, it's the kids who have challenges like some dyslexia or dysgraphia, some attention issues, maybe some auditory processing, whatever. Those are all going to impede the process of being able to find the idea, speak it into existence, hear it, remember it, and record it. But then there's one more nasty step that comes at the end, and that is you have to read what you wrote and determine whether what you wrote reflects very well the idea you started with. And I think we've all had the experience of writing something and then reading it and saying, uh-oh, that's not quite what I was thinking. And then you have to edit that. You have to say, well, this would be a better word than that. Or maybe I should flip the position of these two ideas to make it a little bit clearer. Or maybe this is redundant and unnecessary. Or maybe that needs to be emphasized a little bit more. And so we're running all of these kind of mental calculations based on the database of language we have furnished ourselves with through reading and speaking to refine or distill the thought. And I like the word distill because that means purification, right? If you have distilled water, you have distilled out all the impurities. We won't talk about other things that get distilled, but there is that purification. And so that in itself is this act of judgment. It requires wisdom. You have to have the experience and the will and the humility and the purpose of saying, I'm going to work on this until it's just right. I've had some parents say, oh, writing just takes my child so much time, like hours to get one paragraph done. I understand this. And I quote to them a quote from Oscar Wilde, who reportedly wrote in a letter to his friend, I spent this morning editing one of my poems. I put in a comma. This afternoon, I took it out. Like a whole day just thinking about whether a poem should have a comma in a particular. Why? Because that's the level of refinement and perfection that he's striving for in this written expression. And I don't think that there's any other thing that we have to do that requires this level of full-on brain engagement. Math comes close in some ways, but math is kind of finite, right? There's always a right answer or a wrong answer. And so, yeah, you may struggle to get the right answer, especially if it's too high of math. And that's one area that develops the brain. But with writing, there's always options. There's really never a one right or one wrong thing. It's always a matter of judgment. It's always cultivating wisdom. And in doing that, it requires the development, if you will, of character and virtue. And yes, it's something that a machine can do, possibly better than you. At least when it comes to technical grammar and punctuation and all that. These large language models pull from huge, massive amounts of written stuff. And yeah, you could probably say, okay, write that for me. But what would you be losing when you outsource your thinking? What are we losing if we teach kids it's better to go tell a machine to do something than for you to wrestle with it and learn how to do it? And I would make the analogy with calculators. I think everyone can understand this analogy. Say you have two people. One person does not know their multiplication tables. They cannot really do any mental math. They can't estimate numbers. They don't really understand fractions or decimals or any algebra, but they've learned how to punch numbers in a calculator and put answers on a page. Versus a person who does know their math facts, can do mental math, can make estimations, understands a little bit about fractions, decimals, and algebra, and maybe a little higher operation. Okay, you got these two people. Give them both a calculator. Who's going to use it better? Everyone always says, yeah, of course. The person who knows math, at least a little bit, is going to use the tool better than the person who really wouldn't know if their answer was off by a magnitude of 100. Well, I would argue it's very similar now with the tools we have for language. Who's going to use the AI large language model editing and composition capabilities better? The person who never learned to write and has never wrestled with how to get thoughts into, in an accurate or semi-accurate form, or the person who grew up having to learn all that stuff and practicing, hopefully, until it was easier and they had this level of confidence. I think we all can see. So let us not fall into this trap of saying that we want to, not teach a skill to children because there are machines that can do this better than most people. I don't know about you, but I don't think about education that way. I don't think that it's all just about practical utility and how do we, worst case scenario, how do we just merge with AI? So now we don't even have to ask it. It's just in our brain and it knows what we want to ask and just spits out whatever we would want. I don't think, are there any people who actually want to go there? Any people who want to kind of just abdicate on being human? No. I think what we are all about is growing our capacity for thinking well, for understanding well, for communicating well, because in a way, that's going to be how we transmit the truth from one generation to the next. That's, in a way, how we're going to have the capacity for loving and caring and respecting and hearing and serving each other. And I do tend to be a little pessimistic about technology. Always have been, probably always will be. But I don't want to be categorically a Luddite. Well, actually I do. But there's a time and a place. But let us not get to that point where we don't continue to educate children in the truly human things so that our children do become more full, more ready, and more exact in the use of thought and language. God bless you.